So today's topic, Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge. And I'm going to throw this out here, and Sean, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but Poverty Ridge is the only Sacramento neighborhood that has a rock song named after it. Sacramento's own Ghost Town Rebellion wrote the song Poverty Ridge. So if you go to YouTube and you just Google Poverty Ridge, Ghost Town Rebellion, Sacramento, it is there. And their lead singer, Sean Peter, Sacramento native, also a terrific historian in his own right, gives a tad of historic context before the tune and then a little bit after. So Ghost Town Rebellion. Sean and I were talking a little bit earlier before we brought everyone on about Dunbar, Dyson, Beck. And Bruce Marwick did a talk on Beck on March 23rd. So I encourage you all to go to the Sacramento Public Library YouTube page, and you'll find that talk there. Terrific talk, a lot of great art, imagery, and of course, the really terrific insights that only Bruce can provide as a real master of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in Sacramento when it comes to architecture, culture, the arts, etc. So with that said, today's speaker, author Sean Manwaring, who is a local historic preservationist. Sorry, I had to let someone in. Local historic preservationist and resident of Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge. In this book, he paints a vibrant picture of the people and events that shape the origins and evolution of these two distinct Sacramento neighborhoods. Sean has served as a board officer of the Newton Booth Neighborhoods Association, and he's helped lead the design and installation of historic street markers with an accompanying walking history guide for the Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth historic districts. So he's worked really, really hard in concert with a lot of other residents in that area to really bring the neighborhood alive. So again, a user of the Sacramento Room and a very, very precise historian you'll see when you take a look at the book. Oh, and by the way, congratulations on the reviews. 5-star reviews on Amazon and great reviews on Goodreads. So with that, like I told you, Sean, I can just keep talking. I'm going to turn it over to you. Ladies and gentlemen, Sean Manwaring.
Thank you, James, for the introduction, for having me today to share my research into these two neighborhoods. As you mentioned, I served on the board of the Neighborhood Association, of the Newton Booth Neighborhoods Association, specifically as an officer for the last 6 years. I have a deep love of California state history, but Sacramento history is closest to my heart. And when we purchased a Tudor revival, a 1937 Tudor revival home, just on the cusp between Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth about 10 years ago. And we just fell in love with the neighborhood. And as we'd go on walks in the evenings, we'd look at all of these stately homes and ask, who built them? What's their story? And so that's really what inspired me to start researching. And then when our neighborhood association decided to engage the city on installing historic street markers for the two historic districts, that further fueled my research. And it really became my favorite pastime on the weekends to delve into, oftentimes in the Sacramento Room, the archives and learn as much as I could about the people that created the community of Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge as it is today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll get started. All right. So before I get started, I wanted to point out that you're going to see acronyms that are designating image rights for the different contributors. So CSH would be Center for Sacramento History, CSL, California State Library, Sacramento Room, so on and so forth. So we'll go ahead and get started with the boundaries, the modern boundaries of Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge as they are recognized today. Poverty Ridge is bounded by 19th Street to the west, R Street up here to the north, 24th Street to the east, and WX Freeway to the south. Newton Booth is bounded by 24th Street to the west, R Street to the north, 30th Street to the east, and WX Freeway to the south. And for the last 120 years, more or less, 120 plus years, these are the neighborhood boundaries. As they've changed very little. Now, within both Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth, there are also the Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth historic districts, and those basically are going to look like little gerrymandered maps because they're just penciling in contributing resources. So the only changes to the neighborhoods, I'd say, over the last 150 years is in Poverty Ridge, and that's because if you can see my mouse cursor here, between the 21st and 22nd blocks of QP and almost to the end of O Street, that's where the elevation of the ridge kind of tapered out. And so that was also considered part of the ridge for some time until about the turn of the 20th century. And they excavated a lot of that land to shore up levees around the city, as well as grading it. We had elevation loss when they graded it for development for homes. But you can still see some signs of that. For example, when you're driving down Q Street and you see the hill there next to the B headquarters and you drop down suddenly, that's a remnant still of where the ridge continued to taper off on the 21st and 22nd blocks towards O. I also wanted to just take a quick moment. I jumped right in and I forgot to say how much I appreciate James's assistance in researching and preparing this book and securing specific images that I was having a hard time finding elsewhere. So I really appreciate the support of the Sacramento Room and the archives of the Central Library. And thank you again for having me and for giving me this opportunity to share the research with others. So moving on to the colorful moniker Poverty Ridge, where does that come from? We often have friends who visit out of town and they ask, they take a look around at the houses and they say, Poverty Ridge? What gives? It's always a fun story. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it already, that in the early days of the city, specifically during the floods of 1850 and 1862, people were so desperate to escape the floodwaters, they really only had two options for high ground. The old city, the space that is occupied today by the old city cemetery, and then of course, Poverty Ridge. Poverty Ridge was the only hill within central city boundaries. The cemetery being just outside of the city grid to the south. And so as you can see here in this excerpt from 1862 article in the Sacramento Bee, it was described, the ridge was described as an island in a sea of floodwaters, that it was the only thing above the floodwaters. And as such, families and Sacramentans rushed to the hill to escape the floodwaters and were stranded there until the floodwaters receded. I actually found an old newspaper article in the Bee as well. This is also featured in Thompson and West, Sacramento County. They feature this event during the Great Flood when Sacramentans who were on the train along our street became stranded because there were problems with the levee there, and they actually evacuated people on boats to the ridge, a block over to get them to the ridge, waiting for those floodwaters to recede. So those stories do pan out. But my question in my research was, we know that they said people look so desperate and distraught and down and out that the colorful term was coined Poverty Ridge. But when did they start calling it that? Was it immediately after the flood of 1850? Here we see already in Civil War era Sacramento that it was recognized as Poverty Ridge. So as I researched, I found that originally that lone hill was referred to as Oak Hill or Oak Ridge. It was also at times called Zabriskie's Ridge after Colonel Jc Zabriskie, who was an early settler in 1849. He's considered the first settler up on to establish a homestead up on the ridge. And so where modern day Richmond Grove neighborhood is today, roughly R Street to W Street and 16th Street to 19th. there was a grove of oak trees there. And that grove continued from 19th up onto 22nd Street, basically between T and W streets. And so there were oak trees up on the hill too. So they would refer to that as Oak Ridge or Oak Hill because that grove of oak trees went up onto the western edge of the hill. But over time, of course, they began to refer to it probably around the 1850s is when it first starts appearing as Poverty Ridge. So what happened in the floods following 1850, obviously, and the flood of 1850 led people to recognize it by that name. However, I also found an interesting newspaper article. There's always another story, right? There's always another take. And this one I found kind of humorous just because I felt that it was playing to the vanities of some of the original settlers up there on the hill. And you'll see why. It was an 1886 article in the San Francisco Examiner that basically referred to Poverty Ridge as Sacramento's Nob Hill. And it basically highlighted some of the big movers and shakers in state politics and in the state economy who had gotten their start early on in 1849 and the years following the gold rush up on top of that hill. And what these pioneers that they interviewed said was that it was a lovely place to live and that they were very prosperous and that they didn't experience any flooding during the Great Floods. Their homes were safe and dry. Their livestock was safe, their families were safe, and they didn't really experience any property damage. And that as a result, their fellow Sacramentans in jealousy tried to slight them by calling their little hill Poverty Ridge. But they said it was a pleasant place and we loved it and we never let it get to us. I thought that was kind of funny. Some of these early pioneers are featured here in this slide. So we'll start with Colonel Jc Zabriskie. He in 1849 traversed the continental United States with his family from New Jersey, and he purchased a parcel up on the 21st block of T Street and settled there with his family. He built a homestead and they called it Oak Cottage because of course they were up on Oak Hill. And he served as the second city magistrate after the original charter of 1849 and was an early proponent of excavating earth from the ridge and using it to shore up the very weak rudimentary levee system that they were trying to build at that time to shore off the floods. And so he lived up there with his family from 1849 until roughly the 1860s when they relocated to San Francisco. In 1851, just a couple of years after the Zabriskie's arrival, their daughter Mary was wed up at Oak Cottage up on Oak Hill or on the ridge to a young aspiring attorney by the name of J. Neely Johnson. You may have heard of him. They were wed up there on Oak Hill, and the Johnsons lived with the Zabriskies for several years after that. Of course, 5 years later, J. Neely Johnson would go on to become governor of the state of California. While living on the ridge, he went into practiced law with two of his neighbors, Robert and Murray Morrison. They were brothers who arrived respectively in 1849 and 1850. And as attorneys, they started a law practice with J. Neely Johnson. They were very successful. They lived up on the 22nd to 23rd blocks of Uptown Alley to V Street, what's modern day Uptown Alley to V Street. And Robert became Sacramento City Attorney and later went on to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of California. Lastly, we have Colonel Kewan here. He is believed to be the first to have been a part of the first matrimony ever officiated in Sacramento. Arriving in 1849, he was also an attorney and lived he had crossed the plains with the Dr. White family. He married Dr. White's daughter and they lived up on Poverty Ridge. And he went on at the age of 24 to serve as California's first Attorney General. So we have a lot of people who are really involved in the state's history that are already living up on the ridge at this point in 1849 to 1855, roughly. And most of them left by 1860. Many of them went on to live, they relocated to Nob Hill in San Francisco. They were affluent state citizens at that point. And so they bragged in this article, this 1886 article in the SF Examiner that the reason it was called Poverty Ridge was really only born of the jealousies of other people. And in some small way, we believe that Poverty Ridge was a predictor to the great ascent to Nob Hill, when we would one day ascend to Nob Hill, arguably the most fashionable district in the state. So that gave me pause and made me laugh a little bit. That's their take on the origins of the name Poverty Ridge. But as I mentioned, most of them relocated after the early 1860s. And so this is when we start to see the first change in development up on that hill. Prior to that, everything was kind of a gold rush era homestead and cottage sites with small farms. But in the 1870s through the 1880s, we start to see a change. We start to see more elegant permanent structures, often mansions. I'd say most of these were mansions at the time, and they would build on one parcel and then develop gardens in the surrounding 6 to 8 parcels. So they were these beautiful homes that were surrounded by lush, beautiful Victorian era gardens. And so here's a few of them. 3 remain standing today and 3 have been lost, unfortunately. The southeast corner of 21st and T Streets was the Frank Richardson home. John Frank and Elizabeth Richardson lived at this property for over 30 years. They both arrived in Sacramento in 1849. And John Frank Richardson was a very successful dairyman and an affluent Sacramento citizen. He actually, just down on W Street along 21st, so just a few blocks down from the house, was his dairy, and that extended all the way to Broadway, modern day Broadway. And that was known as the Pleasant Hill Dairy. So there's another name for Poverty Ridge in early Sacramento's history. And they chose the site as a dairy, he did, because it kept his cows safe from the floodwaters. They're above that flood line and they could graze in peace. This was not the only dairy. There were several dairies and cattle outfits in the Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth areas in the late 19th century. Just a few blocks down from him at 2110 U Street was the John and Eliza Stevens house. This is the oldest extant home in the Poverty Ridge Historic District. So the oldest surviving structure. And it was built in the early 1880s. John Stevens and his family came to California via the Isthmus of Panama during the gold rush days. And he started off as a teamster and worked his way up to president of the Pioneer Box Company. He was a well-beloved citizen and known as Honest John Stevens. And that's how they would refer to him in the press. He was also assigned to be the supervisor of city streets. And he ended up being credited for bringing paved sidewalks to Poverty Ridge, which really got mucked down in the like most of Sacramento in the winter months. On the southwest corner of 21st and T Streets, roughly from T to W and 21st to 20th Streets, was a giant spread belonging to State Senator Frederick Cox. He was one of California's original millionaires, also a gold rush pioneer. He was a cattle and land baron. He got his hands on early on during the gold rush days. He acquired several Mexican land grants. And so that made him exceptionally wealthy. He served, of course, as the president of the Bank of California. And today, that home site is occupied by the Tapestry Square development, if you're familiar with those Tapestry Square brownstones. And that's the property that was once there. At 2201 21st Street, so roughly 21st and V Street on the east side of 21st, is the EP and Ella Howe residence. The Howes were well-regarded educators. Nationally, they were very well known because in his native Iowa, prior to coming to Sacramento, E.P. Howe had published with his father the foremost grammar book, Howe's Grammar, and it was used in schools nationwide at the time. The Howes went on to found their own private school here in Sacramento and to also serve as principals of various schools in the city of Sacramento at the time. And then we have the Herman and Bertha Grau home. Grau was the founder of the Buffalo Brewery, which he built along the R Street corridor at the 21st and 22nd blocks of Q and R Streets. He built that in 1888. And then in 1894, he constructed his residence here on the west side of 21st and V Streets, just across from the house. He was able to keep a close eye on the operations of his brewing operations from the turret of his mansion. And then lastly, near the R Street corridor at 1830 21st Street, originally 1822, but it was moved, what is the Manuel Neves Silva house. Manuel Neves was an immigrant from Portugal, from the Azores Islands. He was a vintner and a master craftsman, and he built this lovely Queen Anne home for his family. It still stands today and is occupied by the Edgar Institute. He had 2 wineries, one of which was right there on our street. It was the California Winery, and he had the Pioneer and the Eagle wineries, and he went on to also cultivate vineyards in modern day Pocket area, and was really responsible for some of the early Delta and Sacramento River vineyards. So, but again, there was a lot of space between these houses. Like I said, they developed gardens on the surrounding parcels. That all changed around the turn of the late 19th century to the turn of the 20th century. We really start to see Poverty Ridge develop into the neighborhood that we recognize it as today. Whereas previously they had developed gardens on surrounding parcels, now every single parcel was being developed into a stately home. And this happened primarily due to two factors, or 2 reasons behind this. One is that previously the R Street railroad was levied. All of R Street, as I'm sure most of you are aware, was a levied road, not a road, it was railroad line. And it really served as a barrier. It stopped people from accessing that and developing that southeast portion of the central city. So when they lowered that, they finally got a handle on flood control, and they lowered that around the turn of the century to street level. And so people were able to access this area with much more facility. But they also, another thing that happened that changed, the second factor, was that the new suburb of Oak Park had been developed in conjunction with an electric streetcar line, of course, shuttled people back and forth through the Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth neighborhoods between downtown and Oak Park. And so it was a lot easier for people to, because even Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth would have been considered a suburb at that time. We didn't have the same sprawl at that point in time. And so those were the 2 things that really sparked development now on this otherwise kind of forgotten hill that had been widely overlooked. And it was really one of the last portions of the central city to be developed as a result. So what we're looking at here at 1903 21st Street is known today as the Daniel Carmichael House. It was built in 1898 by this gentleman right here, Charles S. Robb. He was a conductor for the Southern Pacific Railroad, but he was a shrewd investor. And he invested in with all of his savings in oil and in land, and he became very wealthy, so much so that he was able to retire early from the railroad and focus on his portfolio first, full time. His daughter Myrtle Robb, pictured here below, was wed to Daniel Carmichael in the late 1890s, and Robb deeded them this beautiful home shortly after it was constructed. Shortly after their nuptials, they moved in. Now, Charles and Mrs. Robb also moved into the house with Daniel and Myrtle Carmichael while they were building their home on 23rd and U Streets in the Prairie and Mission Revival styles. Today, that property, that home, is used as the Ivy Ridge Assisted Living Facility. And at a certain point in time, at a later date, both Daniel and Myrtle also occupied that house later on after the Robbs had passed. So the reason I started with Carmichael is he was very affluent. Of course, his land development company and real estate company developed the community of Carmichael that we know today. It's named after his development company. And he also served as mayor of Sacramento. He served in the state assembly. And when these affluent families started building these beautiful homes in Poverty Ridge, the developers, they thought, Poverty Ridge just doesn't have the ring we're looking for to attract these people. So why don't we change the name? So they sought to rebrand it as Sutter Terrace. And a lot of these families were old pioneer families, Sacramento pioneer families. And the intention there was to draw a line, a connection to the city's founding father, in essence, or one of the founding fathers, John Sutter. He was a pioneer. We are pioneers. He was affluent. We are affluent. We are Sacramentans. And so they sought to rebrand it as Sutter Terrace. It was referred to as such in the papers, in the press, but I think that was done really more as a courtesy because almost everybody else, outside of this district referred to it as Poverty Ridge. But you did continue to see it referred to as Sutter Terrace until about the 40s and the mid 1950s. You start to see it referred to even popularly or publicly and in the press as Poverty Ridge again. Another affluent Sacramentan who decided to make a home in Poverty Ridge at the corner of 21st and T Streets, 2022nd Street to be exact, is this. She was a very little woman with a very big reputation. Her name was Mary Ross Roan. This was her dream house, and she had it built in 1911 in the colonial revival and prairie styles. It's kind of a mix there. And she was twice widowed. Her second husband passed away in this house, and she eventually did too. But prior to that, when her first husband was a banker, a very successful banker and investor, and he passed away unexpectedly. And there was this obscure bylaw or rule that he was the director of the board of the Bank of Sacramento. And that obscure bylaw or rule allowed her to take a seat on the board. She eventually became director of the board of the Bank of Sacramento and commanded such respect from her male colleagues that they referred to her affectionately and with respect as the woman banker at a time when there were no women in banking at the turn of the century. And it was under her leadership that women in Sacramento were permitted to open their own checking accounts, their own accounts without a male co-signer, a husband or a father. So that was pretty progressive for the time, and that was due to her leadership. Now, later on, after she passed, several owners later, the home was acquired by J. Frank and Genevieve Didion. And it was in the 1950s, their granddaughter, Joan Didion, who we've all heard of, was a student at McClatchy High School. And she lived with her family in this home for those last 2 years at McClatchy. So today it's colloquially referred to as the Didion House. And at the corner of 22nd and V Streets, we have another affluent Sacramentan who built in Poverty Ridge at the time, mostly because he designed the house for his next door neighbors there on 22nd Street. And he liked the neighborhood so much, he decided to build his home there as well. He was arguably the most prolific civic architect in Sacramento at the turn of the century. That's Rudolph Adam Harold, as seen in this sketch. He designed the Marshall School, the Sacramento Hall of Justice, the Elks Lodge. Perhaps most notably, Old City Hall, as you see in the sketch, is his most enduring work today. And he did a very interesting mix of Viennese and prairie styles in his design. It's the only home I'm aware of in the central city that has on the portico plaster faces carved into the portico there. So it's a very interesting house, and it's spawned a lot of stories over the years. There's an adjunct professor from Sac State. She wrote a historic fiction on it. That's kind of a ghost story. So it really does get people's imaginations going when they walk by this house with the faces there on the front porch. Of course, his famous neighbors that really introduced him to the neighborhood or the district were CK and Ella McClatchy, owners of the Sacramento Bee. And, their children were grown at this point. Both Charlotte and Carlos had left the nest. And Eleanor was an adolescent away at finishing school at the time. And this was really, this beautiful Beaux Arts style mansion was meant to be their forever home, their last home, right? So they built this home truly for themselves. And the McClatchy family, I can't state enough how the impact, as I'm sure many of you are aware, that they have left, not only on the city of Sacramento, but the impact they've had specific to this neighborhood, to the Poverty Ridge and Newton Booth neighborhoods. They were preservationists. They were major patrons of the arts. They were conservationists. So, and they've really had a lasting legacy on not only our city, but again, these neighborhoods, because during the redevelopment period, as I'll speak about in a moment, they saved several structures from being razed in the neighborhoods. You hear these anecdotal stories all the time, and I try to stay away from those. I certainly don't publish them, but during my research, I had one old timer in the neighborhood tell me that, you know, the McClatchys were very humble. They didn't talk about these things, but at one point, Eleanor McClatchy had bought dozens of historic homes at a loss around the central city to save them from being razed, and then later sold them for adaptive reuse or for residential again when it was safe. So I thought that was interesting. So a lot of people pass by this house located at 2124 U Street and don't give it much thought. This was also a property that belonged to the McClatchy family. They acquired it around the 1920s. And whether they redesigned the pre-existing home, there was a structure there. I wasn't able to determine if they built this home from scratch or if they did a major renovation and remodel on the exterior as well. You can't build walls like this today. You can't get permits to do that. This is a 10-foot wall, 12-foot wall with huge iron spikes on the top that goes all the way around. People that live in the Poverty Ridge neighborhood refer to it often as the compound because the entire thing is walled with this like a fortress. And hiding behind that wall is this beautiful Spanish colonial revival home. It has a lot of Moorish and Andalusian elements to it, specifically in the gardens, a major Moorish and Andalusian influence. And shortly, when Carlos McClatchy died unexpectedly in the 1930s, his father, C.K. McClatchy, called Eleanor, who had been studying theater at Columbia in New York. He called her home. He said, "We need you." His health was failing, and he needed someone young and with the energy to helm the ship and help with the family business. So being the dutiful daughter that she was, Eleanor returned home and took up residence in this house. Prior to that, her parents used this as a guest house for visiting family and colleagues and friends. But Eleanor ended up taking up residence in it and lived in it until her death. So to give you an aerial view of what this looks like here, you can see this is, again, what we call the compound, 2124 U Street. And you see, here's the Rudolph Harold House. And you see here the library today, but CK and Ella's home, and that its backyard, you know, connected to 2124 U Street. And that was part of the allure of acquiring this property, is their guests could stay here and they could share the gardens and access each other through the rear without having to walk all the way around the block, and within their privacy, maintain their privacy. So in the 1920s, Eleanor was actually married. You can see here in this historic photograph in the gardens at 2124 U Street. But the marriage went south pretty fast. This is previous, of course, to her coming home to lead the bee for her father. And so her brother Carlos made the situation go away. They paid off the husband, and she never married again. So that's an interesting photo from the perspective of the gardens. This photo right around 1930 is taken, was commissioned by Senator Hiram Johnson, former California governor, of course, U.S. Senator from California, presidential running mate with Teddy Roosevelt. He and C.K. McClatchy were dear friends. They had a long correspondence and were great confidants. And so Grove Johnson, Hiram's father, as a widower, built a craftsman bungalow just a couple blocks east of the McClatchys. And so when he'd come into town from Washington, he'd pop in and see Dad and then walk up a couple blocks to visit his dear friends, CK and Ella McClatchy. And here they are photographed in those Andalusian gardens of 2124 U Street. This would have been right before Eleanor was summoned back. And he says in the inscription, "To a very dear friend, CK, my best wishes, Hiram Johnson." And I was so excited to find this image. I hadn't seen it before. So when I came across it, it was very exciting. Here are images of the gardens. Here you see the Moorish star-shaped reflecting pool. You see that there's Spanish tiled wall fountains, Spanish tiled benches, all in keeping with that Spanish revival, colonial revival movement, or the revival movements of the 20s and 30s. Just different images of the gardens. Now, in contrast, here's a shot of the gardens looking right outside of CK and Ella's home. And you can see that it's more of a traditional garden here. Ella loved spending time out on the patio surrounded by her flowers, and would spend a lot of time there in her later years. Charlotte McClatchy Maloney, the eldest McClatchy daughter, and Eleanor would often throw parties on the back patio of 2124 U Street to celebrate the service of tenured bee employees. And here's an image of that in 1943. They were always held. It became a grand tradition, and they would hold it on her back patio. She would also have the players over to put on alfresco performances all the time in the backyard. They would often choose a Spanish romantic theme, because they had this beautiful backdrop in her gardens. And here you see her cutting a slice of cake for an attendee at that 1943 event. Now, as redevelopment, as I mentioned, began to really kick in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, old homes were redlined. These old neighborhoods were redlined. We saw a lot of old properties neglected. They were falling apart, and they were razed to build freeways, to build parking lots, to build new office buildings in the central city. And Eleanor McClatchy got ahead of this quick. She quickly purchased the John and Eliza Stevens home to the west of her. And then she also picked up the Rudolph and Francis Harold home, or rather the family had acquired that, and were able to preserve this entire half block was under McClatchy control until they donated the library. And both the Harold and Stevens homes up until the last 8 years remained within the McClatchy family. So she preserved all 4 of these homes. Here you can see them from Street View, what they look like. Here's an image of Ella shortly before her death in 1939 on her beloved patio, surrounded by her spring tulips and flowers. When she passed away, Charlotte and Eleanor McClatchy decided to donate their parents' home to the city of Sacramento. The CK McClatchy High School had recently been christened in honor of their father, of course, and they felt that they wanted to also have a civic building tied to education that complemented the building named in honor of their father. And so they decided to donate the library, their parents' home, as a library for youth, specifically with materials specifically aimed at the needs of students. And this was done in part to cut the commute time from McClatchy High to the Central Branch in half, so that students were more easily and it could more quickly and readily get to a library that just specialized in materials for their needs. And it was a smash hit. It was a very comfortable, homey environment. At the time, it was the only private residence that had been converted into a library in the state of California, possibly in the country at the time. It made national headlines, and children of all ages came. You see here some students in the 1940s. Thank you, Sacramento Room, for sharing this image with us, reading and studying. I'm sure there was a little bit of flirting going on there too. And of course, the branch in time became a standard branch, not just specific to youth. But here you see some small youngsters there for story time out on the back patio. Now, this is a cool picture because you can see an angle that we rarely see today of Eleanor's house from that back patio. And as time went on, immediately following the donation of her parents' home as a branch, Eleanor decided, I want to keep my mother's gardens. I like those memories. I want to keep them. And so she worked with the city and, also reparceled that portion of her parents' gardens so that it became part of the quote unquote compound. And that's where the wall then went up that currently, separates her home from the library today. So you couldn't access this fountain today. Of course, this was her mother's gardens. Here you see the youngsters. Shortly after these photos were taken, she did have it annexed into her property. Here is dear Eleanor. During the redevelopment phase, she saw firsthand what was going on with raising buildings, because the old B headquarters, which they had long outgrown, was also in the way of the wrecking ball. There was a freeway going up. There was a lot of redevelopment downtown. So they turned their attention to the old Buffalo Brewery complex at 21st and Q&R. and razed the building and constructed a modern media headquarters on that site, which still stands today. I always wonder if there wasn't a little bit of self-interest here, knowing that Eleanor wouldn't have to drive if she didn't want to, and that her commute would be brought down to 4 blocks from her home in Poverty Ridge, right there to the headquarters on Kewan streets. So this takes us to Newton Booth now. We're going to transition to Newton Booth. Newton Booth really didn't start to develop into the neighborhood we see today until after the turn of the 20th century. There was a sprinkling of small farms and workers' cottages throughout the district in the 1890s, or late 1880s, early 1890s. And basically they were small homes with deep lots that ran toward the alley, and they would have the little farms in there with poultry operations, and they would grow their own vegetables, everything they needed for their families. And then anything extra, any surplus, they would sell on the side. They had stables and barns and little carriage houses facing the alley. And then usually the patriarchs of these families would maintain a 9-to-5 job, usually in the industrial sector. So they'd work down at the rail yards, or they'd work at the Buffalo Brewery, or at one of the wineries nearby. And what happened was, as Sacramento continued to grow and more people started in the 1880s, late 1880s, early 1890s to build these little homesteads, or these little workers' cottages rather, and with farms, they had an increasingly difficult time getting their kids to school because it was a quagmire in the winter. It was very muddy. And in 1896, they petitioned the city. They said, we need a schoolhouse in our neighborhood. We can't afford to send our kids on the streetcar every day. We're working people. And the mud is so thick, our kids can't get to Fremont and Jefferson campuses. So the city responded in 1896 by building this 2-room wooden schoolhouse pictured here. And the following year, they christened it in honor of California's 11th governor, Newton Booth, who was a gold rush era merchant, attorney. He, of course, went on to be governor, and then later a U.S. senator from the state of California. Actually, he didn't finish his term as governor, and that was very controversial. He left it to become, senator, and the state changed the rules after that, so that you couldn't just abandon the governorship of a vacancy. Took place like that again. But he was well beloved, and that's where the name of the school came from. Now, they only built out 1 room originally because they said, there's not enough demand. So if we continue to see growth in the southeastern portion of the city, we'll build out that 2nd room. By 1917, the schoolhouse was bursting at the seams. Of course, in the early 20th century, we started to see a lot of development in the neighborhood, and that growth just continued after the arrival of the streetcars. And here you see a classroom full of students in the old wooden schoolhouse. Pictured in the back is one of the Howes. This is Helen Howe. Remember, her family is the E.P. Howe family in Poverty Ridge, the famous educators. And she went on to teach at the Newton Booth School, as did Rose Sheehan, another Poverty Ridge resident. We'll get to some other neighborhood families that also taught at Newton Booth School. So there was a real connection between the neighborhoods and the school, where previous pupils and students would come back and teach as adults. But they had really outgrown the space. Of course, they built out that 2nd room, and they had no space left. So the city, there was a bond measure passed in 1920 to 1921. They were able to either build from scratch or raise and expand pre-existing schools around the city. And the Newton Booth School was the largest of those schools built with the bond money. It was built, as you can see, in brick in the Spanish Revival style, which was very popular in the 20s and 30s. And you start to see this influence construction in the neighborhoods, like the home we bought that is Tudor Revival. You see the First Church of the Nazarene on 28th and S Streets, which is also Spanish Revival. You start to see that influence throughout the neighborhoods, lots of colonial, Spanish, and Tudor Revival buildings. And over time, people began to call the neighborhood Newton Booth after the school, because it really was the focal point of the neighborhood. a lot of families that moved into Newton Booth also had ties to Sacramento's humble beginnings. Adolph Teichert Jr. Was one of these residents, early residents of Newton Booth at the turn of the 20th century. He and his wife, Augusta, who was the maternal granddaughter of the Hilbron family, their beautiful Second Empire located downtown that we're always nervous is going to get razed, but it's still standing, and they built that new state building around it. They didn't end up moving it. That was her family. So he married into another pioneer family as well. His father was Adolph Teichert Sr., who was issued the 8th contractor's license in the state of California. And today it's the oldest active contractor's license in the state. Of course, now they're known as Teichert Co. They're one of the largest contractors in Northern California. Adolph Teichert Sr. was responsible for paving the sidewalks and the pathways around the newly built state capitol in Sacramento, as well as several of the pathways in Golden Gate Park. And this was right around the time that Adolph Jr. Got married, had started a family, and this was their starter home, located at 25th and T Streets. They purchased it, or they moved in. It was built in 1910, but they moved in around 1915. And they lived there for several years, started their family there. And then when he became president of Teichert Co., they built a new house in East Sacramento. Another family that really was part of the fabric of the Newton Booth neighborhood was the William and Estelle Ohl family. This is the oldest extant home in the Newton Booth Historic District, located at 2507 W Street. It was built in 1892 by William Ohl, simple Queen Anne style workers' cottage. The Ohls had a farm in the back all the way to the alley with livestock, and they sold what they could on the side, while William maintained a job as a firefighter and then later worked at the rail yards. And all three of their children attended the old wooden schoolhouse. Their daughter, Alda, and their other daughter, Vivian Ohl Yost, were both teachers at the Newton Booth School. So just like the Howes and the Sheehans, they returned to the old Newton Booth School and taught as well at the same place they'd attended grammar school. So a lot of connection there. We also have Fannie Ray Grubbs, and she is pictured. Some of you may be familiar with her. There are exhibits for them at the County Museum. And Fannie Ray Grubbs was actually the daughter of a former slave. They moved to Sacramento from Texas. And Newton Booth at the turn of the century really became a diverse middle to working class neighborhood, and it had people from all walks of life. Prior to that, I don't think you saw as much of an African-American presence buying and building homes in the central city. And here you start to see people from different ethnic backgrounds come to Newton Booth and become part of the fabric of that community and help build it into what it is today. She bought this home at 2618 S Street in 1913, shortly after it was constructed. And I believe this was an investment property. She moved there from Oak Park, and with the intent of raising the foundation even higher one day. But it was built to kind of have a micro unit, as you can see down below, with the intent of raising it even higher and expanding it out in future years. She died just a few years after purchasing this home, but it was one of several income properties that the Grubbs family owned in the central city at the time. And Newton Booth really became more of a transient. There were a lot of rentals. It became, going into the 30s and 40s, especially during the war, a lot of families lived together. They consolidated expenses. They came together, and multiple generations would live in one home. There was a high demand for apartments at that time. And here's another example of a family that's really interwoven into the fabric of the neighborhood. This is the three children you see here from the Boyles family. Edgar Boyles and Ava Montfort Boyles were both from Gold Rush pioneer families. They Shortly after it was constructed in 1912, they purchased this home. They moved in around 1914 with their two children, Marion and Edgar Jr. And shortly thereafter, they had their third child, Bertie, who was born in the upstairs bedroom at 2523 U Street in Newton Booth, in this arts and crafts bungalow. And Ava died when Bertie was a toddler. So she never really knew her mother. And Edgar raised the three children alone. All three children were graduates of the Newton Booth School and went on to come back to the neighborhood. As I was mentioning, through the years, their kids attended, they lived in the family home, their kids attended Newton Booth School. So intergenerational, cross-generational, you see a lot of families that stayed and kept coming back to the Newton Booth neighborhood. And Bertie was an exceptional student. She was a fencer. She was on the fencing team at Stanford University. She was one of the first female graduates of Stanford University to come from Sacramento. She, shortly after graduation, the American Red Cross was recruiting female college graduates to help with the morale boosting mission on the front lines in Europe. They basically were recruited to drive a canteen, a mobile canteen, and bring coffee and donuts and elevated conversation to the soldiers and try to help keep their morale up. And there was an event while she was there on the front lines where there was unexpected enemy fire. There were explosions detonating left and right. And Bertie got her crew into that canteen and maneuvered around the bombs, around the explosions, and safely and got her crew to safety. And for that, she was awarded the Bronze Star. So quite an accomplishment. Here you can see Bertie in the 1970s. She spent the remainder of her life maintaining and protecting the family home, singing a duet in the 1970s with her dog George. He'd go, well, they played the piano, and from what I understand, it was quite the show to watch. She was a well-beloved activist in Sacramento, especially in the arts community. She was part of one of the co-founders of the Sacramento Arts Cooperative. She also was a woodblock artist, and her work was featured extensively at the Crocker Art Museum. She also dedicated a tremendous amount of time, volunteer hours, post-retirement at what's now known as the Center for Sacramento History, helping with archiving documents, ephemera, and photographs. So quite the story there from the Boyles family. The home, after Bertie's passing a few years ago, actually, the home left the family for the first time and is being cared for by a new family. I would be remiss, this is our last slide for the presentation, to cover the Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge neighborhoods without mentioning our dive bar, the Round Corner Tavern. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And originally, believe it or not, this was kind of a classy lounge opened by Lou Calderon. They often would say fine eats and a flower for the ladies, and in their advertisements. And so it was a place where, classy folk could come and have a martini and a light meal and relax. It was considered an upscale pool lounge originally. That's why that corner is rounded. It actually was meant to mirror the rounded corner of a pool table. And by the 1960s, that crowd had kind of moved on. Fisher Marble and Tile was operating on our street. You had, as James mentioned, the beautiful Mission Revival style Pac Bell building, the Pac Bell yards right there. And as soon as the workers got off the clock, where did they come? They came flowing into that Round Corner Tavern. At this point, it took on more of a tavern feel. They'd come in for drinks, for lunch, for dinner. After work, they would share, fraternize there, have a beer. They spent so much time there, the local R Street workers, that they would cash their checks there on payday. Up until very recently, the Round Corner Tavern would cash your check for you on payday. Of course, they would always take out, clear the balance sheets for the tabs for all of the different workers before giving them the remainder of their paychecks. But it was a popular watering hole for them. And perhaps the most colorful personality in the history of the Round Corner is no stranger to most of us Sacramentans. That's Dorotea Puente, our sweet, elderly landlady, phenomenal cook extraordinaire. And in the 1980s, she leased the kitchen at the Round Corner Tavern and with an associate. And it was during that time that her associate Ruth here fell on, was going through some difficulties with her family. Her husband was hospitalized. And so she, to save money, moved in with Dorothea at her boarding house. And of course, it took no time for her to become mysteriously ill and then pass away. It was a real shock to the family. And the family was suspicious, but no charges were brought. And it's believed that this was one of Dorothea's first victims. Not surprisingly, the day of, within days of Ruth's passing, Dorothea cleared out all of their joint business accounts and took all the cash. Now, the kitchen at the Round Corner Bar, it's been published. Who knows? It's a fun story. Several of the chefs have said that Dorothea's ghost haunts the kitchen and that they smell the sickeningly sweet grandmotherly perfume, that things will move unexpectedly, unexplainably when no one else is there, pots, pans, etc. And that, and she was apparently known as quite the cook. And those local R Street workers loved her food when they would come in the 80s. So that's a colorful piece of history there. So that concludes the presentation. The last thing on this screen here is you'll find on the last page of the book, it's a historic walking tour for the street signs. We'd always looked at other street signs in the Central City historic districts. Boulevard Park has that horse buggy, because of course that used to be the state racetracks for the state fair. In Mansion Flats, you see the governor's mansion, because that's really the focal point of that neighborhood. And so when we were considering what to submit to the city, we had the idea of featuring and paying homage to different historic neighborhood personalities throughout the two neighborhoods. People who are really part of the story of Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge. And we thought, this can maybe get people curious and interested in learning more about the neighborhood's histories. So we worked with the city to feature a different historic property or personality on all the different signs. The one catch was that the city had certain rules about how many signs you could have in sequence, what blocks they could be on. So for example, the Adolph Teichert home is not near his house at 25th and T. His sign representing him is a few blocks away. If you take the tour here on the last page of the book, you can follow the key and it'll take you to the page that provides further context to that personality. But this map is taking you to the historic street signs. If you want a historic walking tour that takes you to the actual location, the home or the property where this person once lived or where this property stands, you'll want to go to www.newtonbooth.org/news. There you can download on that page in PDF format the walking tour to the actual sites, not just the street signs. You can also navigate some Google Map tours that are located on that page as well. Please, if you haven't already, I invite you to buy the book. We have donated all authors' proceeds to support the L.A.K. McClatchy Library branch. They really need our support, especially now they've continued to be closed due to COVID restrictions, and it's such a small space. And it really is the heart and the cornerstone of our neighborhood. If the city were to get rid of that library, the deed stipulated that if the city were to get rid of that branch, which they've tried to do before, that it would go back to the McClatchy family. And so that library would be lost to our community forever if that were to happen. So please support the library. You can buy the book at Time Tested Books, Beers Books, Avid Reader at Broadway. Those are all our local independent bookstores. They need our support now more than ever, post-COVID or during COVID. But also, I donated 150 copies. My spouse and I donated 150 copies to the Sacramento Library Friends to sell on their Amazon storefront. And 100% of the proceeds, not just authors' proceeds, but 100% of the proceeds sold through their storefront on Amazon will go to support, it's split both ways, the McClatchy Library branch as well as the library system in general that's supported by the SAC Library Friends. And this is a quick link to the storefront for the Friends. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, everybody. Sean, brilliant talk. Thank you so much. And I'm going to have to say, I'm so embarrassed that I didn't know that you and your spouse had done that, had donated the books to the Friends for sale. I mean, it's remarkable. So thank you for that gesture and helping McClatchy and helping the system in general. Like I say, without the friends, there's no SPL. They're massively influential in making us go. So with that said, how about questions? I'd like for everybody to keep their mute on and keep their video off, but fire us some questions and Sean can answer away. Just in that chat feature. And now I'm supposed to say he was obviously so thorough that he covered all bases across the board. And you were quite thorough. And I might add that a lot of what you did, Sean, in the presentation and in the book is really driven toward human interest, which to me is just, and just as I say that, we do have a question. I did not quite understand why it was called Poverty Ridge when the richer residents lived there. Can you address that, Sean?
Sure. So during those early floods in the 1850, 1862, people would, to escape the floodwaters on Front Street, they would just grab what they could carry in their hands and haul it to the only high ground, which was the hill. And they were trapped up there. They had to camp up there, and they just looked tore up and destitute. It looked like a shanty town from the accounts while they waited for those floodwaters to recede. And so people started referring to it as Poverty Ridge. Of course, once the levees were fortified and the R Street tracks were brought down to street level, people began developing very beautiful, ornate, expensive houses, but the name still stuck. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, so thank you, Sean, and thank you for the question. Another one from Maddie. Does the garden in the compound look the same as it did during the McClatchy family's time? Does it have the same architectural features like the reflecting pool and tile benches? And I'm feeling that your answer is going to have something to do with the great mystery of it all.
Well, I've never actually been in the compound like most of you. I've seen it from I've seen it when I've been inside of the John Stevens house next door from the second floor, or I've seen it from the second floor of the library, but I've never actually been in it. From what I can tell, most of those features appear to be intact. It is the only historic McClatchy family property that remains in, as far as I'm aware, that remains in McClatchy hands in the central city today.
Okay, and you all remember earlier when I was having trouble with the functionality of the chat feature. I'm going to go ahead, because I can, is put in the link to that video to Poverty Ridge, so you can all like rock out to the shredding of Sean Peter in the band. It fits. It speaks a lot to the flooding and that seeking of higher ground that one could only find at Poverty Ridge. So I just posted that. Okay, any other questions, gang?
I see there was one from Heather.
Oh, okay.
And she said, can you talk more about how the railroad may or may not have influenced the development of the neighborhood? Can I answer?
Absolutely, go ahead.
So Heather, that's a great question. It really, I think, fueled the growth of the neighborhood, in part because, for example, I talked about Manuel Silva Neves. I mentioned who had the winery there on our street. Of course, Herman Grau, who had the Buffalo Brewery. Later, of course, the New Bee headquarters, even into the 50s. You see that the railroad is what brought that industry. I feature Fisher Marble and Tile, the Pacific Bell Yard. All of those things were built intentionally along our street, and that access, the Fisher Marble and Tile building, for example, on 23rd and off of 23rd and S between S and R, that was originally a grocer, and they were able to keep perishables cold in the basement and then quickly load it onto the tracks. the rail cars there to get the perishables out quickly. And so that definitely was a driving force. It was used for distribution, absolutely. Especially in the late 1890s and through the 1950s. If you actually look at how the Sac Light Rail goes along our street and then raises around 20th to 19th streets, it begins to go up and it goes over 19th by Safeway and then drops down again by the Bark Park. That was actually done so as not to interrupt the Bee's distribution at the time, their distribution network, where their trucks came in and backed up to the different loading docks. And so as I know that the Bee's been moving away from print for obvious reasons, but as recently as the 80s, when they built that elevated light rail line, our street was still serving the needs. They specifically built it there also to get things out on rail as well, or get materials in. So absolutely.
Okay, so thank you, Sean. And by the way, everybody, I just went ahead and posted a Word document with our upcoming programs with Roland DeWolk coming up on the 24th. I'm speaking in May about living memorials in the First World War. And then we have Lorena Marquez, who's going to speak on La Gente and the rise of the Chicano liberation movement in Sacramento during the 60s and 70s. And then more to come after that. Let's see, do we have any other questions? It looks like Elizabeth has a comment here. Eleanor McClatchy was a wonderful employee. When my parents were going to take their first trip to Europe, she had my father, who was an editor for the Bee, come over to her home, and she went over where they should visit and shared her books on Spain with Dad. That's a neat little story about the McClatchys. And I've heard that about Eleanor. In fact, I've seen several photos of staff parties that she would have in the compound. You know, and like Sean said, 4 blocks, it's a Friday. Let's get going. Or I guess the newspaper is a 7-day a week, 24/7 kind of thing, whenever they can find time. All right, so any other questions? Okay, all right. Well, Phyllis has a comment. Awesome. Beautiful words. Thank you, Phyllis. So everyone, thank you for joining us. And of course, thank you, Sean, for this wonderful talk on a really, really fascinating part of our city. An original work. Like I was telling Sean earlier, it's hard to find something about these areas without going into the Bee and the Union. It's now in this wonderful book with great photographs. And of course, you can tell the TLC that Sean put into it, putting it together. So with that said, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Sean, thank you. And thank you for keeping the history alive. I want to see you all on April 24th at 3 o'clock with my friend Roland DeWolk as we talk about Leland Stanford. And with that said, we're signing off. Farewell from the Sacramento room.